Hello there, and thank you for being here tonight. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe the day is still hanging around a little. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Where are you listening from tonight? Is there quiet around you, or can you hear the world going on in the distance? Tonight, we're going back to the very beginning. Not the beginning according to modern textbooks, but the beginning according to the oldest written records humanity possesses. The Sumerian tablets, the cuneiform inscriptions that speak of beings called the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven to earth. For over a century, scholars have translated these texts, and for over a century they've disagreed about what they actually mean. Some say the Anunnaki were simply mythological figures, symbols of natural forces dressed in divine clothing. Others believe something more remarkable is encoded in those ancient clay tablets. A memory, a record. Perhaps even a history that predates what we call history. We're not here to settle the argument tonight. We're here to sit with the questions, to read what the tablets actually say in their own words, and to wonder, as humans have wondered for 5,000 years, what the Sumerians were trying to remember. Now, settle in. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders drop. There's no rush. The tablets have waited millennia to be read. They can wait a few moments more while you find your comfort. Imagine, for a moment, the world before Sumer, before cities, before writing, a wide landscape with no clear borders yet. Water spreads, then withdraws. Mud dries, then softens again. Somewhere in that setting, someone decides to make memory last longer than a voice can carry it. A small piece of clay is lifted from the ground, cool and damp in the hand. Fingers smooth its surface. A reed is pressed into it, leaving a shallow mark, then another, each impression deliberate. This is not art yet. It's not literature. It's record, intention, and patience. That simple act will change everything. Once memory can be stored outside the body, it begins to collect more than grain counts and trade agreements. It gathers stories. It gathers obligations. It gathers names meant to endure. Names like An, Enlil, Enki, and the Anunnaki themselves. And so we begin. Some readers approach these lines as myth, shaped to explain labour, authority, and social order. Others suggest they preserve older memories, compressed into symbolic language. A few imagine something more literal. Tonight, we won't force an answer. We'll let uncertainty remain part of the landscape, just as it always has been. If your mind tries to solve everything at once, you can let that effort soften. There's no puzzle to complete here. There's only a path to walk slowly, with pauses built in, and room to rest along the way. Before we go further, I want to ask one small favour. If this kind of calm, thoughtful history helps you unwind, a like or a subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps this quiet space reach others who might need it too. Thank you for that. Now, settle in, adjust whatever needs adjusting. Feel the surface beneath you holding steady. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your breath slow without being guided. Good. There's no rush. In a moment, we'll begin with the world before the cities, before the temples, before the kings. We'll start with rivers moving across open land, with stars overhead that have barely changed at all. For now, just stay here, listening as the night continues to deepen. Somewhere beyond this room, the same sky stretches quietly over land and water. Long before cities, it watched rivers spread and retreat. Long after names fade, it will still be there. You don't have to hold that thought tightly. You can let it rest beside you, gentle and unfinished. The story will keep unfolding whether you listen or sleep. For now, it's enough to be here, breathing, present and unhurried while the night does its slow work. Nothing is required of you except allowing the quiet to continue. It will, gently, whether noticed or not. That has always been its way. Slow, patient, and unbothered by time, just like the world we're entering, together, now, here. In an age when the land had not yet learned permanence, this place moved slowly and without urgency. The air carried more moisture than dust, and the horizon felt wide because nothing interrupted it. When the sun rose, it illuminated water and reeds rather than walls, and its warmth spread across a surface still deciding how it wished to be shaped. The Tigris and the Euphrates did not yet obey channels or banks. They wandered across the plain, splitting and rejoining, spilling into shallow marshes that glimmered beneath open sky. Each flood arrived quietly, not as destruction but as renewal, and each retreat left behind a thin layer of silt that darkened the ground and softened its surface. The rivers shaped the land not through force, but through repetition. If you stood near the water then, your feet would press into damp soil that yielded gently. The ground felt cool, alive, holding the memory of recent rain. You could smell it too, an earthy scent mixed with the faint sweetness of wet grasses. Insects moved constantly through the air, and birds gathered along the edges of the floodplain, their calls low and unhurried. As the great ice sheets far to the north began to withdraw, the climate here shifted almost imperceptibly. Temperatures rose gradually, and rainfall became more reliable. Seasonal wetlands expanded and contracted in steady cycles, creating a landscape that rewarded attention. Those who returned at the right times found fish trapped in shallow pools and wild grains growing thick along the water's edge. Perhaps this reliability taught patience. Perhaps it encouraged observation rather than urgency. The land did not demand conquest. It responded best to those who learned its rhythms and moved alongside them. In this way, survival became a quiet collaboration rather than a struggle. At night, the warmth of the day released itself slowly from the ground. Cool air settled across the marshes, and sound softened into a continuous hum. Frogs called from unseen places, and insects pulsed in layered patterns that rose and fell without sharp edges. Above it all, the sky opened fully, revealing stars scattered thickly across the dark. The same constellations that hang overhead now were already present then, shifting only slightly over centuries. When people lay back on the ground and looked upward, they saw patterns that would outlast every settlement yet to come. The heavens offered steadiness in a world still arranging itself. The moon played its quiet role as well. Its light traced pale paths across the water, and its pull encouraged subtle movement in the rivers and pools. Even without knowing why, people could sense the connection between sky and water. Perhaps this awareness would later take shape as belief. Or perhaps it already had. From a distance, this land might have seemed empty, flat, unremarkable. But within it, change accumulated slowly. Each flood laid down another invisible layer. Each retreat revealed new ground. Over time, the surface grew smoother, richer, better able to sustain repeated return. Without intention, the land was preparing itself. Small human groups passed through, staying briefly before moving on. Temporary shelters were raised and dismantled. Fires burned low and faded. Footprints softened and disappeared with the next rain. The land absorbed every trace, keeping no permanent record of who had been there. Memory, for now, lived only in the body. Silence shaped this world as much as water did. Long stretches of it allowed awareness to deepen. Without constant noise, subtle changes became noticeable. A shift in wind, a difference in watercolour, the sudden absence of birds. These details mattered. They taught attentiveness long before it was named. Over time, habits formed, not of ownership but of return. The same places were visited again and again, not because they were claimed, but because they were dependable. The land rewarded familiarity. It remembered those who remembered it. As days warmed, shallow pools left behind by retreating floods reflected pale light. The water trembled slightly as breezes passed across it. Fish moved slowly through narrowing channels, and birds stepped carefully along the edges, waiting for the right moment. Nothing here rushed. Time did not feel linear in this place. It felt circular. Water spread and withdrew. Light rose and faded. Seasons turned and returned. The same patterns repeated often enough to become expected. In that expectation, something new became possible. Eventually people began to linger longer, not yet to build, not yet to stay forever, but long enough to notice continuity, long enough to trust that return would be rewarded, long enough for memory to stretch beyond a single season. The rivers continued their quiet work, unaware of what they were preparing. Above them the sky remained unchanged, patient and vast. Between water and stars a way of life was being shaped, slowly and without announcement, setting the stage for the first marks in clay and the first attempts to make memory last. There was a time when people moved through this land without calling it theirs. Paths formed not from intention, but from repetition, and even those paths softened quickly under rain and wind. The world felt open then, not owned or divided, but shared quietly among water, sky, animals, and those passing through. Groups arrived slowly and left just as quietly. They followed the seasons more than the terrain, returning when water returned and moving on when it withdrew. Their presence was light enough that the land barely noticed. No walls rose, no markers remained, only temporary traces that faded with the next change in weather. Shelters were simple and brief. Reeds gathered from the marshes were tied together, then taken apart again. Hides were stretched, then folded away. Fires burned low, not meant to be seen from far off, their smoke drifting upward and dissolving into open air. Nothing here was designed to last beyond the moment. The ground underfoot changed constantly. In the early morning it felt cool and damp, holding the night's moisture. By midday it warmed and tightened, cracking slightly as the sun climbed. These textures mattered. They told people when to move, when to rest, and when to wait. Knowledge lived in the body before it ever lived in language. Food came from observation rather than control. Fish were taken from shrinking pools left behind by receding water. Birds were caught along familiar edges. Seeds were gathered where grasses grew thickest after floods. This was not farming yet. It was attention practiced over time. Perhaps this attention shaped early thought. Perhaps watching carefully became a form of understanding. The land responded best to those who noticed small changes and adjusted quietly rather than forcing outcomes. Patience was rewarded more often than strength. Stories existed, but they were fluid. Told at night, shared close to firelight, they shifted with each telling. Memory was communal, not fixed. What mattered was not exactness, but meaning that could travel from one person to the next without needing to be preserved perfectly. At night, sound carried easily across open ground. A cough, a footstep, a distant animal call could be heard far beyond its source. Silence surrounded these sounds, not empty, but full of subtle movement. Wind passed through grasses, water shifted gently, insects pulsed in layered rhythms that never fully stopped. Above it all, the sky remained steady. Stars rose and set in familiar patterns, slowly enough that change was almost imperceptible. People learned these patterns without naming them. They knew where light would appear and when. Darkness would deepen. The heavens offered consistency in a world where most things changed. The moon marked time without words. Its cycles shaped movement and rest, influencing when people travelled and when they stayed close to water. Even without explanation, its return became expected. Its absence felt noticeable. Perhaps this was one of the first rhythms to be trusted. Children learned by watching rather than being instructed. They followed elders, copying movements and habits. Knowledge passed hand to hand, gesture to gesture. There were no written rules to break, only patterns to absorb and repeat. As generations passed, familiarity with certain places deepened. Not ownership, but recognition. A bend in the river where fish were plentiful. A stretch of ground that stayed dry longer after floods. A grove where birds nested reliably. These places were remembered through use, not names. Silence continued to play an important role. Long stretches without speech allowed awareness to widen. Without constant language, the senses sharpened. Small details became meaningful, a change in wind direction, a different smell in the air. The land communicated quietly, and people learned to listen. Perhaps this way of living encouraged humility. The world did not revolve around human plans. Survival depended on cooperation with forces larger than any individual. Water, weather, and time set the terms. People responded. As the climate stabilized, returns became more predictable. Floods came and went with increasing regularity. The land's generosity became dependable. With that dependability came new possibilities. Lingering no longer felt risky. Staying began to seem reasonable. Still, nothing compelled permanence yet. The idea of building something meant to last beyond a season had not fully taken shape. The land provided without demanding ownership. Movement remained part of the rhythm. The sky continued its steady rotation. Stars watched over countless nights without comment. The same patterns observed by one generation were observed again by the next. Continuity existed, even if it was not yet named. Over time, memory began to stretch further back. Stories referred not just to parents and grandparents, but to people no longer living. The past gained weight. experience accumulated. The need to remember more accurately began to press gently against the limits of oral tradition. Perhaps this was when something shifted, when memory started to feel fragile, when repetition alone no longer felt sufficient, when the idea of fixing information, of holding it in place, began to form. The land remained patient. Rivers continued to spread and retreat. The sky remained unchanged. But among the people moving through this space, a new awareness was growing, a sense that what had been learned should not be lost. Soon, hands would press clay into shape not just to build walls, but to hold meaning. Soon, marks would replace gestures. Memory would leave the body and enter the world. For now, though, this was still a place without names. A world guided by return rather than record. A time when nothing was permanent and everything important was carried quietly from one moment to the next, waiting for the form it would eventually take. There came a period the later Sumerians would describe as different from all others, a time remembered rather than dated. It was not placed neatly on a timeline, nor anchored to a single generation. Instead, it existed as a remembered condition, an age when the world felt closer to whatever guided it. In this remembered time, the boundary between forces seemed thinner. The land still shifted often. Rivers changed course without warning, and wetlands appeared where dry ground had been before. Stability had not fully settled, and perhaps because of this, unseen influences felt nearer, more immediate, less abstract. People spoke of presence rather than distance. They did not imagine gods far away, separated by vast reaches of sky. They imagined them involved, attentive, woven into daily life. When later texts describe gods walking among humans, this may reflect that closeness, a sense that guidance was not remote. Perhaps this was a way of explaining order as it began to emerge. Perhaps it was how memory translated gradual change into narrative. The stories do not rush to clarify. They assume familiarity, as though the listener already knows what is meant. The environment still played its part. Rivers continued their cycles, sometimes generous, sometimes disruptive. Floods could nourish or overwhelm depending on timing. When something unpredictable yet powerful shapes survival, it often becomes sacred. The gods may have begun here, named as patterns before being imagined as figures. Silence remained important. Long intervals without speech allowed space for interpretation. The night sky, unchanged and vast, watched over these quiet moments. Stars rose and set in steady paths, offering contrast to the instability below. Perhaps this contrast encouraged belief in higher order. Fires burned low in the evenings, their light soft rather than commanding. Shadows moved along the edges of vision, merging and separating as people shifted position. In that uncertain glow, it was easy to imagine more than what was visible. Presence could be felt without being seen. Stories from this period often speak of instruction, of beings who organized, measured, and decided. They did not simply create and disappear. They advised, they corrected, they set limits. This reflects a world-learning structure, assigning authority to forces beyond any individual. Some scholars suggest these gods represent social memory of early leaders. Others believe they are symbolic frameworks for understanding natural law. Still others argue that these accounts preserve something more literal, an experience remembered but no longer fully understood. The texts themselves do not resolve the question. What matters is tone. These stories are not defensive. They do not argue for belief. They state calmly that this is how things were. The certainty belongs to the telling, not to explanation. As generations passed, these accounts were repeated with care. Not rewritten each time, but retold with attention. Certain details remained constant. Certain names endured. Others shifted, softened, or merged. Memory adjusted itself as needed. The sky continued to offer reference points. The moon marked cycles that influenced movement and rest. Its phases became familiar companions. Even without written record, its return provided reassurance. Perhaps this reliability was attributed to divine intention. When storms arrived, they did so suddenly. Thunder echoed across open land. Rain fell hard, then passed. Such moments carried weight. They reminded people that control was limited. Appeasing unseen forces felt reasonable when faced with power that could not be negotiated. Over time, stories linked these forces to specific roles. One governed the sky, another shaped water, another oversaw fertility or justice. This division of responsibility mirrors human organization. It reflects a world learning to categorize influence. Perhaps the gods were a way of making sense of complexity. Or perhaps they were memories of relationships that once felt tangible. We may never know. What we do know is that belief began to structure behavior. Actions were taken not only for survival, but for alignment. Offerings were made, rituals observed. Certain times were considered favorable, others avoided. The land itself did not resist these interpretations. It continued to change slowly, indifferent to names and stories. Yet its rhythms reinforced belief. When rituals coincided with successful harvests or safe passage through floods, meaning attached itself easily. Children grew up hearing these stories as given, not debated. They learned which forces mattered, which names carried weight. Authority was not yet centralized, but it was no longer absent. At night, when the sky spread open above small groups resting near water, the sense of being observed may have felt natural. Stars seemed close enough to matter. The world felt inhabited in ways that did not require proof. As memory stretched further back, stories grew denser. They accumulated layers. Events were compressed, roles exaggerated, meanings deepened. The past became populated with figures larger than any living person. This was not deception. It was preservation. It was how fragile experiences survived repetition. Gradually, these stories began to anchor themselves to places. A river bend where something important occurred. A clearing associated with instruction. Space and story intertwined. The need to fix these memories grew slowly. Oral tradition remained strong, but repetition alone felt risky. Details shifted. Emphasis changed. What mattered could be lost. Perhaps this was when the idea of recording took hold, not yet fully, formed, but present. A sense that memory should be held somewhere more durable than breath. The gods, once felt, now needed names. The stories, once fluid, began to seek shape. The world was moving toward something new, even if no one yet recognized it. Above all of this, the sky remained unchanged. Stars continued their patient rotation. The same patterns that guided early observers still watched silently. The age when gods were said to walk among humans did not end abruptly. It faded. It transformed. It left impressions rather than boundaries. What followed would not erase these memories. It would give them structure. It would press them into clay, preserving not certainty, but belief. And so, as the world moved toward record and permanence, the unseen did not disappear. It prepared to be written, waiting for the moment when memory would leave the body and enter the earth itself. When the first archaeologists brushed away layers of soil in southern Mesopotamia, what emerged was not a statue or a monument, but something quieter and more intimate. Small fragments of clay appeared first, hardened by fire and time, carrying marks that were too deliberate to be accidental. These objects did not demand attention at a distance. They invited it up close. In places like Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, these tablets were found resting within layers dated to around 3200 BCE. Their size varied, but many fit easily into the palm of a hand. When held, they felt dense and cool, their surfaces smoothed by careful fingers long gone. Light falling across them revealed shallow wedge-shaped impressions, angled and repeated with intention. These marks were not stories yet. They were records, counts of grain, tallies of livestock, notes of distribution and obligation. Writing, at its beginning, was practical. It emerged not from poetry, but from the need to remember accurately what the human voice could forget. Memory, once externalized, no longer depended entirely on repetition. Perhaps that shift mattered more than anyone realized at the time. When information could be stored outside the body, it could accumulate. It could outlast a single lifetime. It could be compared, corrected, and expanded. The act of pressing a stylus into clay quietly altered how humans related to time. The process itself was slow. Clay was gathered from riverbanks, kneaded until pliable, and shaped carefully. A reed stylus was pressed into the surface at specific angles, producing standardized forms. Each impression required attention. Each pause between marks allowed for thought. Writing did not rush. It demanded patience. Archaeologists date these tablets using the layers in which they are found, comparing soil composition, nearby organic remains, and the architectural phases surrounding them. The dates are never exact. They shift slightly as new discoveries are made. Still, the pattern remains clear. Writing appears suddenly and then spreads quickly. Almost as soon as writing appears, something else joins it. Names, titles, references to beings beyond the human. Administrative tablets begin to include mentions of temples, offerings, and divine estates. The sacred enters the record alongside the practical, without hesitation or explanation. Some scholars believe this reflects an already established belief system finally gaining a written form. Others suggest that writing itself encouraged the formalization of religion. Perhaps once ideas could be preserved, they took on greater authority. What was written felt stable, enduring. The earliest tablets do not explain the gods they mention. They assume familiarity. This suggests the beliefs they reflect were already widespread. Writing did not create the divine, it recorded it. The sensory experience of these objects matters. Clay holds warmth when newly shaped, then cools as it dries. When fired, it becomes firm, resilient, capable of lasting millennia if protected from water. The material itself reinforces the intention behind it. These were memories meant to endure. Cylinder seals found alongside tablets add another dimension. Rolled across wet clay, they left repeating images. Figures seated, standing, approaching. Animals, symbols, gestures. Each seal belonged to an individual, serving as signature and identity. When pressed, it connected a person to a record permanently. Perhaps this was the beginning of institutional memory. Not just individual recollection, but shared reference. Something that could be returned to, consulted, trusted. The transition from oral memory to written record did not happen overnight. For a long time, both existed together. Stories were still told aloud, rituals were still learned through observation. Writing supplemented memory rather than replacing it. Yet its influence grew. Once marks could hold meaning, complexity increased. Records became longer, categories multiplied, distinctions sharpened. Society itself began to reorganize around what could be documented. We may never know exactly how people felt about this change. Did they see writing as powerful, as sacred, or simply as useful? The tablets do not record emotion. They record outcome. Still, the act of writing required training. Not everyone could do it. Scribes emerged as specialists, learning standardized forms and conventions. Knowledge began to concentrate in certain hands. Authority followed. Perhaps this concentration influenced later ideas of divine order. If knowledge could be controlled, then power could be justified. If memory could be fixed, then hierarchy could be stabilized. Archaeological evidence shows writing spreading rapidly across the region. Variations in signs appear from site to site, then gradually standardize. Communication expands. Administration deepens. Yet even as writing grows more complex, it remains grounded in material reality. Clay cracks, tablets break, many are lost. What survives does so partly by chance. Fragments found today often preserve only portions of texts. Lines begin and end abruptly. Context is missing. Scholars reconstruct meaning cautiously, comparing fragments across sites and periods. This incompleteness leaves room for uncertainty. We may never know what was written on missing pieces. We may never know how many stories failed to survive. What we do know is that writing transformed memory into something shared and external. It allowed belief, obligation, and authority to travel further and last longer than any voice could carry. As more was recorded, more could be imagined. Creation stories took shape. Divine genealogies formed. The relationship between humans and gods became structured in language. The first marks in clay did not announce what they would become. They simply existed. Practical, intentional, patient. Yet within them, the foundations were laid for something larger. A world where memory could be stored, consulted, and inherited. A world where gods could be named, roles defined, and power explained. And as these marks multiplied, as tablets accumulated and records deepened, the figures mentioned within them began to take clearer form. Names repeated, roles stabilized. Among those names, one group would appear again, When the name appears for the first time in the tablets, it does not arrive with explanation. There is no introduction, no clarification, no attempt to define what is already assumed to be known. The word simply exists, embedded among records of land, labour and ritual, as though its meaning requires no justification. The term Anunnaki is most often translated as offspring of Anu, with Anu identified as a sky god associated with authority and order. Yet translation is never neutral. Meanings shift subtly over centuries, and words that once carried layered understanding often flatten when rendered into modern language. What mattered to the original writers may not align perfectly with what survives on the page. In the tablets, the Anunnaki do not behave like distant abstract deities. They are presented as a collective. They deliberate, they judge, they assign roles and responsibilities. Their actions are described calmly, without dramatization. This tone is important. It suggests familiarity rather than awe. Perhaps these beings were understood as forces that structured reality rather than disrupted it. Perhaps they represented order itself, personified so it could be remembered. Or perhaps they were something closer to lived experience, translated into language that could survive repetition. The archaeological context deepens the question. References to the Anunnaki appear in administrative texts, hymns, and later mythological compositions. They are not confined to a single genre. Their presence crosses boundaries between practical record and sacred narrative, suggesting they occupied an integrated place in Sumerian thought. Stone reliefs and cylinder seals provide visual accompaniment. Figures appear wearing horned headdresses, a symbol consistently associated with divinity. They are often depicted larger than surrounding humans, seated or standing in positions of calm authority. Their expressions, when visible, are composed rather than threatening. Light plays across these carvings in subtle ways. Shallow grooves catch shadow, revealing form only when viewed from certain angles. The images seem to change slightly as the eye moves, encouraging slow observation. Perhaps this was intentional. Perhaps meaning was meant to unfold gradually. Some scholars believe the Anunnaki represent a priestly or ruling class remembered symbolically. Others argue they embody natural forces such as sky, earth and fertility, organized into narrative form. A few suggest the texts preserve memories of encounters that were later mythologized. Each interpretation finds partial support, but none resolve the question fully. The tablets themselves complicate certainty. Many are broken. Lines end abruptly. Names appear, without context. In some cases, only fragments survive, requiring scholars to reconstruct passages by comparison with later copies. Every reconstruction carries uncertainty. We may never know how literal these descriptions were to those who wrote them. Did they imagine the Anunnaki as physical presences, or as forces encountered through ritual and dream? The texts do not say. They assume understanding that no longer exists. What is clear is that the Anunnaki were not marginal. They were central to explanations of how the world functioned. They appear in creation narratives, in discussions of fate, and in stories explaining why humans exist at all. The sensory world in which these beliefs operated matters. Temples echoed with chants. Incense burned slowly, filling enclosed spaces with a heavy, sweet scent. Offerings were placed carefully, their textures and colours chosen with intention. Ritual engaged the body as much as the mind. Silence also played a role. Long pauses between actions allowed space for presence. The absence of sound carried meaning. Perhaps this quiet was understood as attentiveness, a condition in which the Anunnaki could be perceived. The sky remained an ever-present reference. Many Anunnaki were associated with celestial bodies. Their movements were mirrored in planetary cycles. Watching the heavens may have reinforced belief that these beings governed order beyond human reach. Modern astronomy can trace those cycles with precision, mapping planetary paths backward through time. It can confirm what ancient observers saw. What it cannot confirm is what those observations meant to them emotionally or spiritually. Perhaps the Anunnaki were a way of bridging observation and meaning, a way of translating patterns into agency. When the sky moved predictably, someone must be responsible. When order emerged, someone must have planned it. In this sense, the Anunnaki may represent the human impulse to assign intention to structure, or they may represent memories of teachers who organized early society later elevated through retelling. We may never know which interpretation comes closest. The evidence resists resolution. The Anunnaki remain present in the text but absent from certainty. Yet their influence is undeniable. Through them, humans understood themselves as created, assigned, and obligated. Work became purposeful, authority became justified, existence gained explanation. As writing continued to evolve, these figures would take on more defined roles. Their involvement in creation would be elaborated. Their relationship to humanity would be debated. The story does not stop with their appearance. It deepens, it complicates, it moves toward a question that would shape everything that followed. If gods helped create humans, then what did that make human rulers? The story of human origins, as preserved in the Sumerian tradition, does not unfold with simplicity. It begins instead with deliberation. Decisions are discussed. Solutions are weighed. Creation is not effortless, but considered, almost negotiated, as though existence itself required agreement before taking shape. In texts later gathered under names like the Atrahasis epic, humans are not formed in isolation. They emerge through collaboration between divine forces shaped from earthly material and something more elusive. Clay is gathered, familiar and abundant along riverbanks, but it is mixed with an element described as divine essence. The language is careful, ritualistic, and repeated with intention. The clay itself is important. It is the same substance used to build walls, shape vessels, and record memory. It smells of water and soil, cool and heavy in the hand. By choosing clay as the foundation of human creation, the texts anchor humanity firmly in the earth. People are not separate from the land, they are formed from it. Yet the addition of divine substance changes the meaning entirely. Humans are not only earthly, they carry something else within them, something connected to the Anunnaki. This mixture becomes central to how responsibility and obligation are understood. Humans work because they were designed to. They serve because service is built into their nature. Some scholars read this as symbolic language, a way of explaining why labour exists at all. Others suggest it reflects an early attempt to describe consciousness, intelligence, or moral awareness. A few wonder whether the story preserves a memory of transformation, compressed into myth because no other language was available. The text does not clarify, it does not defend itself, it states the process calmly, as though it were accepted knowledge. This tone matters. It suggests the story was not controversial to those who preserved it. It explains something they already believed to be true. Why mix substances at all? Why not create humans entirely divine or entirely earthly? Perhaps this mixture reflects how people experience themselves, capable of thought and planning, yet bound to physical limitation. A bridge between realms rather than belonging fully to either. The Anunnaki play an active role in this process. They do not simply command creation, they participate in it. They debate outcomes, they decide responsibilities. This portrayal emphasizes governance rather than domination. The gods are planners, not conquerors. This matters when considering how authority later functions in Sumerian society. If creation itself involved planning and agreement, then order becomes something maintained rather than imposed. Power is legitimate when it reflects balance, not force. Archaeological discoveries support the complexity of these beliefs. Tablets containing creation narratives appear in multiple locations, Sippar, Asher, Nineveh, with variations in detail but consistency in structure. Names change, emphasis shifts, the core idea remains. These variations suggest long oral transmission before being fixed in writing. Stories adapt, slightly as they move through time and place, responding to local concerns while preserving foundational meaning. Writing captures a moment in that process, not its beginning. The sensory world surrounding these stories shaped how they were understood. Recitation likely occurred in temple spaces, where sound carried differently. Stone walls echoed voices softly. Incense burned slowly, its scent thick and persistent. Ritual created atmosphere as much as meaning. Silence between recitations mattered too. Pauses allowed words to settle. Meaning was not rushed. The act of listening was as important as speaking. The sky continued to provide context. Many Anunnaki were associated with celestial bodies, reinforcing the idea that creation followed cosmic order. Human origin was linked not only to Earth, but to patterns observed above. Modern science can trace those patterns precisely. Astronomy reconstructs ancient skies. Geology explains river formation. Biology describes human development. Yet these explanations do not replace the ancient story. They exist alongside it, addressing different kinds of questions. The Sumerian creation narrative is less concerned with how humans formed physically, and more concerned with why they exist socially, why they work, why they serve, why they organize themselves under authority. Perhaps this is why kingship later draws so heavily on divine language. If humans carry divine substance, then some may be closer to its source. At least, that is how belief evolves. The unanswered questions remain. Did the Sumerians believe this process was literal, or did they understand it as symbolic even then? The tablets do not tell us how to read them. They present the story and move on. What we do know is that this narrative establishes a hierarchy. Gods create, humans serve. Order is maintained through cooperation. Disruption occurs when balance is lost. This framework shapes law, ritual, and governance for centuries. It explains obligation without cruelty. Labour becomes purpose rather than punishment. The mixture of clay and divine essence becomes a metaphor that endures. Humanity is grounded, yet elevated. Limited, yet meaningful. Subject to cycles, yet capable of understanding them. As these ideas settle into written form, they prepare the way for a new development. If humans are created to serve and gods plan the world, then someone must stand between these realms to manage that relationship. The story begins to turn toward authority embodied in human form, toward figures who rule not by strength alone, but by claimed connection to the divine source of creation. The emergence of kingship does not come as a surprise. It feels like a continuation, a natural extension of beliefs already established. And so, as creation stories deepen and roles become clearer, attention shifts toward those who would claim to carry divine essence more directly than others. The next chapter opens not with gods alone, but with humans elevated, standing at the intersection of earth and sky, prepared to rule by virtue of their place in this carefully imagined order. At the height of early Sumerian civilization, kingship did not feel distant from ordinary life. It moved through the city quietly, present in routines rather than spectacle. Authority showed itself not through constant display, but through rhythm, repetition, and expectation. Imagine the city waking slowly. Doors open. Courtyards fill with soft voices. The smell of baking bread drifts outward into narrow streets. Somewhere nearby, a scribe prepares clay for the day's records, smoothing its surface with practiced hands. Nothing here feels hurried, and nothing feels accidental. The king does not rule from isolation. He appears among people, visible in rituals and decisions, but rarely removed from the structures that support him. His authority flows through priests, administrators, and workers, creating a network rather than a single point of control. Power is shared, even if it is symbolically concentrated. In the records that survive, kings are often listed alongside officials rather than above them. Their names appear in economic texts, temple accounts, and legal documents, woven into the fabric of daily administration. This placement matters. It suggests kingship functioned as coordination rather than domination. Imagine a public ritual taking place in the early morning. The king stands quietly while offerings are prepared. Words are spoken slowly, carefully. The focus is not on the ruler himself, but on maintaining balance between human activity and divine order. The king participates rather than commands. This role as intermediary shapes everything. The king does not claim to be a god. He claims to serve the gods. His legitimacy rests on alignment, not strength. When things go well, he is praised for honouring the order set by higher powers. When things go poorly, his failure is framed as imbalance rather than cruelty. Daily life continues around this structure. Farmers move through fields at the edges of the city, planting and harvesting according to season. Artisans shape tools, vessels, and ornaments meant for use rather than display. Children learn patterns by watching adults, absorbing order without instruction. Imagine sitting near a workshop as clay vessels are shaped. The wheel turns slowly, hands press gently, correcting without force. The vessel takes form through patience rather than pressure. This process mirrors governance itself. Too much force collapses structure. Too little attention leaves it formless. Temples function as both spiritual and administrative centers, Grain is stored there, labor is organized there, ritual and record coexist. The king's presence in these spaces reinforces his role as mediator, not owner. What belongs to the gods is managed, not possessed. Astronomy continues to guide timing and authority. Priests observe the moon's phases and track the movements of visible planets. Festivals align with celestial events. Decisions are timed to correspond with favorable signs. When human action mirrors the sky, order feels confirmed. At night, the city settles into quiet. Lamps glow softly inside homes. Outside, the stars appear sharp and numerous. The same sky that guided earlier generations now watches over organized streets and planned structures. This continuity reassures those who live beneath it. Yet this balance requires constant attention. Records multiply as society grows more complex. Administration expands. What was once remembered now must be recorded. The king's role becomes increasingly dependent on systems rather than personal presence. Perhaps this shift introduces tension. As governance becomes more formal, flexibility diminishes. Rules replace relationships. Documentation replaces memory. The king must navigate between tradition and change, honoring the old order while managing new demands. Archaeological evidence reflects this. Evolution. Tablets from later periods show increased specialization. Legal codes become more detailed. Economic records grow longer. Authority becomes embedded in process rather than personality. Still, kingship remains framed as service. In inscriptions, rulers describe themselves as caretakers, builders, restorers. They emphasize what they maintain rather than what they conquer. This language reinforces the idea that power exists to preserve balance. Imagine a king inspecting irrigation channels at dusk. The light fades slowly. Water moves steadily through carved paths. The success of the harvest depends on timing and care. In this moment, kingship feels practical rather than abstract. Responsibility is tangible. Floods continue to test the system. When water arrives too early or too late, crops suffer. The king is judged not by intent but by outcome. Divine favour is inferred from results, reinforcing the belief that authority must remain aligned with natural cycles. This framework holds for generations. It creates stability without rigidity. Order without spectacle. Kingship feels embedded rather than imposed. Yet beneath this calm surface, change continues. Population grows. Resources strain. New questions emerge. The intermediary role becomes heavier as society becomes more complex. For now, though, the system works. Humans serve. Gods oversee. Kings coordinate. The city breathes steadily within this arrangement, and beneath the routines and rituals, beneath the records and decisions, quieter layers remain. Symbols, alignments, meanings not fully articulated, waiting to be examined more closely when attention turns inward again. At their height, the Sumerian cities felt alive without feeling overwhelming. Imagine walking through narrow streets as the morning settles in. Walls lean slightly inward, offering shade from the rising sun. Footsteps move slowly over packed earth, worn smooth by years of use. Voices carry softly, never sharp, never rushed. These cities are not accidental gatherings. They are deliberate arrangements shaped by belief as much as by need. Homes cluster around courtyards. Storage rooms sit close to kitchens. Workshops occupy familiar corners, their locations repeated generation after generation. The city grows like a remembered pattern rather than a plan drawn all at once. At the centre stands the ziggurat, rising in layered steps that guide the eye upward. It is not meant for crowds. It is meant to be seen. Its presence anchors the city, marking a point where earth and sky are believed to meet. The stone feels cool in the early morning and warm by afternoon, holding the day's memory in its surface. Imagine placing your hand against its base. The texture is uneven, shaped by many hands rather than machines. You can feel the slight variations where bricks were set one by one. This is construction guided by patience, not speed. The structure does not dominate, it observes. Temples function as more than sacred spaces. They organize labor, store surplus grain, and keep records. Ritual and administration exist side by side without conflict. A priest may perform an offering in one room while a scribe records deliveries in another. The gods are present in both acts, woven quietly into routine. daily life flows outward from this centre. Bakers begin their work early, shaping dough that will feed many households. Potters turn wheels slowly, correcting forms with gentle pressure. Metalworkers heat and cool tools with care. Each task feels purposeful, connected to a larger order that extends beyond the individual. Astronomy remains an invisible guide. Priests track the moon's cycle, noting when months begin and end. Bright planets are watched as they move against the fixed stars. Festivals align with these observations, reinforcing the idea that human time mirrors celestial time. When patterns match, reassurance follows. At night, the city settles into a different rhythm. Oil lamps glow inside. Homes, their lights soft and contained. Outside, the sky opens fully. Stars appear bright and numerous, casting faint shadows across walls and streets. The same constellations that guided ancestors now watch over organized neighborhoods and cultivated fields. This sense of being observed is not threatening, it is stabilizing. If the sky remains orderly, perhaps the city will as well. Belief rests not on fear, but on continuity. The gods are watchers, not intruders. Yet even within this harmony, subtle changes occur. As populations grow, systems become more complex, records increase, regulations multiply. What was once guided by familiarity now requires documentation. The city adapts, slowly, without realizing what it is becoming. Still, from within, this era feels secure. Life follows patterns that make sense. Work, ritual, rest, and return all fit together. The city breathes steadily under the watch of gods whose presence is felt rather than questioned. And beneath the stone, foundations and ordered streets, beneath the rituals and records, quieter meanings remain, symbols embedded in layout and timing, alignments not yet fully examined, waiting to be noticed when attention turns from surface to depth. As kingship settled into routine, something quieter began to matter more than ceremony. Memory. Not memory as nostalgia, but memory as structure, carried carefully from one generation to the next. Authority no longer belonged only to a living ruler. It began to stretch backward, attaching itself to lineage. In Sumerian cities, names were not chosen lightly. A name carried weight, linking the present to what came before. Kings traced themselves through lists, inscriptions, and spoken tradition, tying their rule to earlier figures whose legitimacy had already been accepted. Continuity mattered as much as competence. Imagine a young heir being taught not how to command, but how to remember. He learns the names of ancestors before learning the limits of power. He is told which gods favoured his house, which rituals must never be neglected, which failures should not be repeated. Memory becomes instruction. Royal bloodlines are presented as sacred, not because they are flawless, but because they are connected. The belief that divine essence once entered humanity through creation stories makes inheritance meaningful. If humans carry something of the gods, then descent becomes a way of preserving proximity to that source. This belief appears subtly in seals, inscriptions, and temple records. Symbols repeat across generations. The same divine emblems appear beside different royal names, linking them into a continuous thread. Authority is reinforced not by novelty, but by repetition. Daily life continues beneath this framework. Farmers plant fields as they always have. Craftspeople shape tools that resemble those made decades earlier. Children grow into roles already defined by custom. Stability feels natural because it is familiar. Imagine walking through a residential quarter in the early evening. The air cools as the sun lowers. Voices drift from open courtyards. Meals are shared. Stories exchanged. Few people think about kingship directly, yet its presence is felt in the order surrounding them. Astronomy continues to anchor time. The moon marks months. Stars signal seasonal change. These patterns outlast individual rulers, reinforcing the idea that authority must align with cycles beyond human control. A king may die, but the sky remains. The Sumerian king list itself reflects this way of thinking. It does not simply record rulers. It creates a narrative of continuity, linking mythical reigns to historical ones without sharp division. Time is layered rather than segmented. Some scholars believe the extraordinary reign lengths listed for early kings represent symbolic eras rather than literal lifespans. Others suggest they reflect a different conception of time entirely. The text offers no clarification, it assumes, understanding that no longer exists. What matters is how the list functions. It connects past, present, and future into a single story. Kingship becomes something that flows through time rather than occupying it briefly. Memory gains authority. Archaeological layers support this gradual transition. Earlier inscriptions emphasize divine action. Later ones focus more on human lineage, temple construction, and legal order. The gods remain present, but human responsibility becomes clearer. This shift does not eliminate belief, it refines it. Divine favor is no longer only inherited, it must be maintained. Rituals continue, offerings are made. But lineage alone is not enough. A king must act in ways that confirm alignment. Imagine a ruler commissioning a temple restoration rather than a new monument. The choice reinforces continuity. It honors what already exists. Memory is preserved through maintenance rather than replacement. Yet memory is fragile. Floods destroy archives, fires erase records, conquests scatter tablets. Much of what once existed disappears without ceremony. What survives does so unevenly, leaving gaps that cannot be filled. Perhaps this fragility increased the value of lineage. When records fail, memory carried by people matters more. Names spoken aloud preserve what tablets cannot. Bloodlines become living archives. The stars continue their patient movement overhead. The same constellations observed by early rulers are still visible. This continuity reinforces belief that order persists even when individuals vanish. As centuries pass, new cultures inherit these ideas. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian rulers adapt Sumerian concepts of divine kingship, reshaping them without abandoning the core principle. Authority remains connected to memory. Still today, archaeologists uncover fragments that revise understanding. A newly translated tablet can clarify a lineage or challenge a long-held assumption. The story remains unfinished. We may never know how many names were lost. We may never reconstruct every sequence. Memory survives unevenly, shaped by chance as much as intention. Yet the pattern is clear. Kingship endures by remembering itself. Authority survives not because it is powerful, but because it is remembered as legitimate. As this reliance on memory deepens, another layer begins to form. Beneath bloodlines and names, beneath ritual and record, symbolic meanings and cosmic alignments wait quietly, ready to reveal a different dimension of understanding. That deeper layer has always been present. It simply requires a different kind of attention. Beneath the surface of the tablets, beneath the literal meaning of words and names, another layer quietly persists. It does not speak directly, it waits to be noticed. This layer is made not of sentences but of patterns, repetition, placement, proportion, details that suggest intention beyond simple record. When scholars study Sumerian writing closely, they begin to notice that certain symbols appear together with unusual consistency. Specific signs cluster in ways that do not always change with context. Certain phrases recur even when the surrounding material differs. This repetition feels deliberate rather than accidental. Perhaps these recurring forms were meant to guide interpretation. Perhaps they served as anchors, reminding readers how a passage should be understood. Or perhaps they functioned as safeguards, ensuring that meaning survived even when language shifted. Numbers offer another clue. The base 60 system used by the Sumerians shaped how time and space were measured. 60 divides easily, allowing flexibility, but its persistence across unrelated records suggests more than convenience. Time itself becomes structured through this system, divided into predictable units that mirror celestial cycles. Some believe this numerical order reflects observation of the sky. Planetary movements repeat, lunar cycles return, counting becomes a way of aligning human activity with patterns already present above. Measurement becomes a form of respect. Cylinder seals deepen the mystery. Rolled across wet clay, they leave continuous images rather than isolated symbols. Scenes unfold in sequence, figures approaching seated gods, offerings presented, gestures repeated. These images are not explained in text. They are meant to be recognized. When light moves across these impressions, shapes appear and fade. Meaning depends on angle, on patience, on willingness to look slowly. Perhaps this was intentional. Perhaps understanding was meant to unfold rather than arrive instantly. The arrangement of symbols within texts also matters. Certain divine names appear in elevated positions, separated from surrounding words. Others are grouped deliberately. The layout itself communicates hierarchy. Space becomes meaning. Modern scholars debate whether these choices reflect theology or habit. Some argue scribes followed strict conventions. Others suggest those conventions carried symbolic weight. The truth may lie somewhere between. Habit can preserve meaning long after explanation fades. Silence plays a role here as well. Many tablets contain gaps, broken edges, missing lines, pauses where meaning once existed. These absences are not empty. They invite interpretation without providing resolution. The text teaches restraint. Perhaps the most striking feature of Sumerian symbolism is its refusal to clarify itself. The tablets do not explain their metaphors. They assume shared understanding. Meaning lives between reader and text, not within the text alone. The land mirrors this approach. Ziggurats rise in layered steps that suggest ascent without describing it. Temples align with cardinal directions but do not announce their purpose. Orientation itself becomes symbolic, pointing towards sky and horizon. Astronomy reinforces this hidden order. Priests tracked stars and planets carefully, yet rarely wrote explicit interpretations. Observations were recorded, conclusions were left implicit. Understanding belonged to those trained to see patterns. Modern science has confirmed many of these alignments. Computer models reconstruct ancient skies, verifying solstices and planetary cycles visible from temple platforms. Yet confirmation does not dissolve mystery. It only deepens it. What did these alignments mean to those who built them? Were they calendars, rituals, or reminders of cosmic participation? We may never know. The structures remain silent on the matter. Perhaps symbolism served as a bridge between knowledge and humility. What was understood did not need explanation. What was not fully grasped remained respectfully unspoken. Meaning existed without being exhausted. This approach allowed beliefs to endure across generations. Symbols could be inherited even when explanations changed. A sign carved in stone outlasted the reasoning that first gave it purpose. As centuries passed, these symbols travelled. Akkadian and Babylonian cultures adopted them, sometimes altering pronunciation while preserving form. Meaning shifted slightly, but the structure remained recognizable. Even now, archaeologists encounter symbols whose function cannot be fully explained. A recurring motif appears without context. A number repeats without justification. A placement feels intentional without revealing why. Silence surrounds these questions. It does not frustrate. It steadies. It reminds us that not all knowledge was meant to be explicit. Perhaps the Sumerians understood something we have forgotten. That meaning does not need constant explanation to remain powerful. That restraint can preserve depth. As we sit with these hidden dimensions, it becomes clear that the story is not only written in words. It is embedded in spacing, in repetition, in what is left unsaid. The symbols wait patiently, just as they always have, asking only that we look slowly without urgency, and accept that some understanding unfolds only through time. And beneath those symbols, beneath the lines pressed into clay, another layer remains, one shaped by sky and cycle rather than sign, ready to be explored next. When attention shifts upward from clay and stone, another order quietly reveals itself. The sky, vast, steady, and repeating. For the Sumerians, the heavens were not distant decoration. They were active reference points, observed carefully and returned to night after night with patient consistency. Priests watched the sky with devotion rather than curiosity. They did not search for novelty. They searched for pattern. The moon's phases were tracked meticulously, marking months and signalling ritual timing. Bright planets were followed as they wandered against the fixed backdrop of stars, their movements slow enough to reward sustained attention. Perhaps this is where many of the Anunnaki found their place. Several were associated with celestial bodies, their names linked to visible planets and luminous points in the sky. Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, each followed a path that could be learned, anticipated, and recorded. The heavens offered structure that mirrored order on Earth. What if these gods were not imagined as residing in the sky, but as expressions of it? What if divine authority was a way of naming predictable movement, turning observation into narrative so it could be remembered across generations? The texts do not answer this. They simply align gods with stars and move on. Ziggurats reinforce this connection quietly. Their stepped forms elevate the observer without reaching toward the heavens aggressively. From their upper platforms, the sky appears wider. The city recedes, sound softens, the wind becomes more noticeable. Perhaps these spaces were designed less for communication with gods and more for alignment with cycles. Modern archaeology has confirmed that many ziggurats align roughly with cardinal directions. Some stairways catch light at particular times of year. These alignments are not precise by modern standards, but they are intentional. They suggest awareness rather than accident. Standing atop one at dawn, you would feel the cool air first. The city below would still be quiet, shapes softened by low light. As the sun rose, shadows would shift slowly across brick surfaces, revealing edges and angles gradually. The moment would feel measured, not dramatic. Astronomy provided more than ritual timing. It offered reassurance. The sky changed slowly, almost imperceptibly across human lifetimes. In a world where floods could arrive unexpectedly and crops could fail, this stability mattered. It suggested continuity beyond individual experience. Perhaps this stability encouraged the idea of divine oversight. If the sky remained orderly, then order itself felt protected. The gods associated with celestial movement became guardians of predictability. They did not intervene constantly. They maintained rhythm. Some scholars argue that the Anunnaki were never meant to be understood as separate beings at all. Instead, they may represent aspects of cosmic order broken into roles for clarity. Others suggest they were mythologized ancestors, later mapped onto the sky as their memory grew distant. We may never know which interpretation the Sumerians themselves favored. The texts offer no commentary on belief. They assume participation rather than explanation. Observing the sky was not an abstract exercise. It was part of maintaining balance. Silence accompanied these observations. Long hours passed without speech, eyes following slow arcs across darkness. Patience was required. Nothing revealed itself quickly. Understanding came through return rather than insight. Modern science allows us to reconstruct ancient skies with precision. Astronomers can calculate planetary positions thousands of years ago. They confirm that what Sumerian observers saw matches recorded patterns. This confirmation does not diminish mystery, it strengthens respect. What science cannot recover is experience. It cannot tell us how it felt to believe the stars were attentive. It cannot recreate the quiet reassurance of watching order repeat itself night after night. Perhaps this feeling mattered more than explanation. Perhaps belief grew from reliability rather than fear. The sky did not threaten. It promised return. Even now, the same planets follow similar paths. The same constellations rise and set. The movement is slow enough that it still feels timeless. Looking up, one can imagine ancient observers standing somewhere nearby, noticing the same light. The Anunnaki remain present in this alignment. Whether understood as gods, symbols, or memory, they occupy the space between observation and meaning. They give language to pattern without exhausting it. As centuries passed, these associations travelled forward. Later cultures inherited Sumerian star lore, adapting names while preserving structure. The connection between authority and sky endured, even as interpretations shifted. Perhaps this persistence reflects something fundamental. Humans look upward for guidance because the sky offers what the ground cannot. Distance, continuity, calm. Yet even with careful observation, not everything could be predicted. Eclipses disrupted expectation. Sudden darkness unsettled ritual. These moments reminded observers that understanding was partial. Mystery remained. The sky, like the texts, offered structure without full explanation. It invited attention without promising certainty. It rewarded patience rather than demand. As belief deepened, these celestial associations became embedded in ritual, architecture, and story. They formed a background layer of meaning that did not require constant acknowledgement. And beneath this layer, beneath stars and symbols, another dimension waited quietly. One shaped not by alignment alone, but by what remained hidden underground and time. That deeper layer belongs not to sky, but to Earth itself, where stone and clay continue to hold questions that refuse to settle. Beneath the tablets themselves, beneath the symbols pressed carefully into clay, there is another story waiting quietly in the earth. Archaeology does not begin with interpretation, it begins with removal. Layer by layer, soil is brushed away, revealing not answers but context. At sites such as Ur, Uruk, Nippur and Lagash, excavators encountered cities built on top of cities, walls buried beneath newer walls, streets abandoned, then reused. Each layer represents not an ending, but a continuation reshaped by time. The ground becomes an archive written in depth rather than ink. When you walk through these places today, the surface feels uneven. The earth crumbles slightly beneath your feet. Brick edges soften where wind and rain have worn them down. Nothing here is sharp. Time has rounded everything. Even stone seems patient. Modern archaeology relies on careful measurement rather than spectacle. Soil colour shifts subtly between layers. Pottery fragments appear, then disappear. Burn marks suggest fire. Flood deposits indicate water. Each detail contributes quietly to a larger picture that takes years to assemble. Perhaps the most striking discoveries are not complete objects but fragments. Broken tablets, partial inscriptions, lines that stop abruptly mid-thought. Meaning exists, but it is incomplete. Scholars must compare fragments from different sites, sometimes written centuries apart, to reconstruct a single passage. We may never know how much has been lost. Clay tablets dissolve when exposed to water. Fires destroy archives unevenly. Cities collapse and are reused as foundations. Entire libraries vanish without leaving trace. What survives does so partly by accident. Modern technology has added new ways of seeing beneath the surface. Ground-penetrating radar reveals walls that no longer stand. Satellite imagery identifies buried streets and building outlines, invisible from the ground. Patterns emerge without excavation, hinting at structures still hidden. Yet even with these tools, much remains unseen. Some areas cannot be excavated, others are protected or inaccessible. Political borders and modern development limit exploration. The ancient world lies beneath the present, unreachable in places where people still live. Perhaps this limitation mirrors the nature of the story itself. Not everything can be uncovered. Not every question can be answered. The Earth keeps its own counsel, releasing information slowly, on its own terms. What archaeology does reveal is continuity. Cities were not abandoned suddenly in every case. Many declined gradually. Populations shifted. Rivers changed course. Climate altered conditions. People adapted, rebuilt, and carried beliefs forward even as structures changed. Beneath temple foundations, earlier ritual spaces appear. Beneath palaces, older administrative rooms. Each layer suggests memory preserved, through reuse rather than erasure. The past was not discarded, it was built upon. Silence plays a role here as well. Excavation sites are often quiet. Tools scrape gently. Dust settles. The work demands patience. There is no rush. Attention must remain steady, focused on small changes that might otherwise be missed. Modern scholars approach these remains cautiously. Translations are revised. Interpretations shift. What once seemed certain becomes tentative. New discoveries challenge older assumptions. Knowledge remains provisional. Still today, tablets sit unread in museum collections. Thousands remain untranslated, stored carefully, waiting for time and expertise. Each holds the possibility of altering understanding, yet none promise clarity. We may never know the full extent of Sumerian belief. We may never reconstruct every ritual or story. Gaps remain, and they always will. The record is incomplete by nature. Yet these gaps do not weaken the story. They deepen it. They remind us that history is not a finished account, but an ongoing conversation between past and present. The land continues to shift. Erosion exposes some structures while burying others. Floods uncover artifacts one year and conceal them the next. Discovery and loss exist side by side. As we look beneath the tablets, beneath the written record, we encounter not resolution, but restraint. The Earth offers fragments, not conclusions. It invites humility. And perhaps that is fitting. The Sumerians themselves accepted mystery as part of existence. They recorded what mattered without insisting on total understanding. As we prepare to move from hidden layers toward larger questions, it becomes clear that uncertainty is not an obstacle, it is part of the design. The ground beneath Sumer still holds its silence. It has waited thousands of years. It can wait longer. The question that lingers longest is not about cities or temples, but about relationship. How did the Sumerians understand the boundary between gods and humans, and why did they describe it as permeable rather than fixed? This is where interpretation slows and patience becomes necessary. Some scholars believe the language of mingling and creation reflects metaphor rather than event. In this view, divine substance represents intelligence, order, or social consciousness introduced into human life. The gods do not change biology. They shape structure, they organize labor, they define responsibility. Others suggest these stories preserve memory of early elites, leaders whose knowledge felt transformative to those they guided. Over generations, these figures may have been elevated through retelling, their authority recast as divine origin. Memory compresses complexity into symbol when explanation grows distant. A few imagine something more literal, though they do so cautiously. They point to the repeated emphasis on mixing substances, on deliberate creation, on the gods' concern with reproduction and lineage. They ask why these details appear at all if they were not meant to matter. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between. Perhaps the Sumerians were describing a felt experience rather than a physical process. The sense that humanity was changed by contact with something greater, something organizing and unfamiliar. Language reached for metaphor because no other vocabulary existed. The tablets themselves do not insist on interpretation. They describe, then move on. There is no debate recorded, no justification offered. This calm presentation suggests the story was not controversial. It explained what needed explanation and left the rest unspoken. Comparisons across cultures deepen the question. Many ancient traditions describe gods teaching humans agriculture, law, or craft. These stories appear independently, separated by geography and time. Perhaps they reflect a universal pattern. Civilization remembering its own emergence through narrative. What if these stories are not about origin, but about transition? The moment when humans move from wandering to settling, from sharing to hierarchy, from memory to record. Such a shift could feel external, imposed, even otherworldly. Still, the language of flesh and substance remains. Clay mixed with divine essence, life shaped intentionally. These images persist because they resonate. They speak to how humans experience themselves, as grounded yet aware, limited yet capable of reflection. We may never know how literally these stories were held. Belief does not always require precision. Meaning often matters more than mechanism. Archaeology cannot answer this question directly. Bones do not record belief. DNA tells us about movement and adaptation, not myth. Science describes what changed, not how it felt. Yet absence of evidence does not imply absence of meaning. The Sumerians were not writing for modern readers. They were preserving understanding for themselves and their descendants, using language that worked for them. Perhaps the idea of intermingling expresses humility. Humans are not self-made. They are shaped by forces beyond their control: land, sky, tradition. Naming those forces as gods gives form to dependence without denying agency. Or perhaps it expresses responsibility. If humans carry divine substance, then behavior matters. Actions reflect origin. Order must be maintained because it was intended. These interpretations coexist without cancelling one another. The story is not weakened by multiplicity. It is strengthened. It allows room for reflection rather than resolution. Silence surrounds this question intentionally. The tablets do not argue. They do not persuade. They state and continue. The reader is left to sit with uncertainty. Even now, the question remains open. Scholars revise translations. New fragments surface. Old assumptions are challenged. Understanding evolves without settling. Perhaps this openness is the point. Some stories are not meant to close, they are meant to be returned to, considered again under different skies. As we consider intertwined origins, it becomes clear that certainty is not required for meaning. The Sumerians lived with unanswered questions. They built systems that functioned without resolving every mystery. Their world did not collapse because of uncertainty. It endured alongside it. And as we move toward the final questions, it becomes clear that mystery itself may have been part of the design. an invitation to think slowly, to wonder without urgency, and to accept that some connections are felt rather than proven. The question remains, gently, patiently, unresolved. The questions do not disappear as knowledge accumulates. They become quieter, more refined, and perhaps more enduring. After tablets are translated, sites mapped, and patterns identified, something still remains unresolved, resting gently beyond the reach of certainty. Some scholars believe the unanswered nature of these questions reflects the limits of the sources themselves. Clay tablets were never meant to preserve every thought. They recorded what mattered most at the time. What was assumed did not require explanation. What was debated may never have been written down at all. Others suggest that ambiguity was intentional, that stories of creation, gods, and kingship were left open because belief required space. Precision might have weakened their power. Mystery allowed meaning to adapt as circumstances changed. Perhaps this is why the Anunnaki remain so difficult to define. They are present in the texts, yet they resist clarity. They act, but they are not described physically in detail. They influence, but they do not explain themselves. Their purpose is implied rather than stated. We may never know whether the Sumerians imagined these beings as physical presences, symbolic forces, or something in between. The tablets do not tell us how to believe. They show us what was believed. Connections to other ancient traditions raise further questions. Flood stories appear across cultures. Divine descent recurs in different forms. Kings claim heavenly origin in lands separated by oceans and centuries. Perhaps these similarities point to shared human experience rather than shared events. Or perhaps they reflect patterns of memory responding to similar transitions. When societies become complex, when authority emerges, stories arise to explain and justify change. Gods enter the narrative to provide continuity between what was and what is. Modern science offers context without closure. Archaeology explains settlement. Anthropology explains social structure. Astronomy explains observation. Each discipline illuminates part of the picture, but none resolve belief itself. Even now, new discoveries complicate rather than simplify understanding. A newly translated tablet may introduce a name never seen before. A revised interpretation may alter the meaning of a familiar passage. Knowledge shifts, refusing finality. Perhaps this is not a flaw, but a feature. The ancient world was not built on rigid answers. It functioned through balance, repetition, and adjustment. Belief evolved alongside circumstance. We may never know how many stories were lost entirely. Fires destroyed archives. Floods erased libraries. Political change scattered records. What remains is a fraction, shaped by chance as much as intention. Still, this fraction carries weight. It reveals a worldview comfortable with layered meaning, one that did not require full explanation to remain effective, one that allowed unanswered questions to coexist with daily order. Perhaps this comfort with uncertainty is what allowed Sumerian civilization to endure as long as it did. Systems remained flexible. Authority could adapt. Belief did not fracture under pressure. The sky offers a useful comparison. Stars were observed carefully, yet their nature remained unknown. Their movement was predictable, their substance mysterious. This did not diminish their importance. It enhanced it. Silence plays its role again here. Not absence, but space. The kind of space that allows thought to rest without needing resolution. The tablets leave room for this silence intentionally. As modern readers, we often seek closure. We want answers that settle questions permanently. The Sumerian material resists this impulse. It invites return rather than conclusion. Perhaps that invitation is the legacy. To sit with complexity, to accept partial understanding, to recognize that some truths are experienced rather than proven. The Anunnaki remain, not as answers, but as markers of wonder. Kingship remains, not as domination, but as responsibility shaped by belief. Creation stories remain, not as science, but as meaning. Even now, these questions live quietly in museums, in academic debate, in private reflection. They are not urgent. They do not demand resolution. They endure. And as we move toward the final reflections, toward legacy and stillness, we carry this understanding with us. That mystery does not weaken knowledge. It deepens it. Some questions are meant to remain open, not because they cannot be answered, but because their value lies in being returned to, slowly, across generations. The civilization faded as all civilizations do, not in a single moment, but through a long process of shifting attention. Cities were not erased, they were repurposed, thinned, and eventually left behind as rivers changed course and priorities moved elsewhere. Names that once carried authority slipped into silence, surviving only where clay happened to endure. Yet memory did not vanish, it changed form. Stories travelled forward even when walls collapsed. Beliefs adjusted without disappearing. What could no longer be practiced was remembered. What could no longer be remembered was reshaped. Writing itself became the vessel of survival. Tablets buried beneath collapsed buildings escaped fire and flood by accident rather than design. Centuries later, they waited quietly, sealed in dry earth, holding fragments of a world that no longer knew it would be read again. When modern excavations began in the 19th century, rediscovery unfolded slowly. Broken tablets were mistaken for debris. Symbols were unrecognized. Entire collections sat unread for decades. Understanding returned gradually, through patience rather than revelation. As scripts were deciphered, the Sumerian world began to speak again. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to reveal its shape. Names surfaced, rituals reappeared. Kings returned as lists rather than individuals. Gods emerged as roles rather than forms. Even now translation continues. Thousands of tablets remain unpublished, stored carefully in museums and archives. Each one carries the possibility of reshaping interpretation, yet none promise certainty. Discovery deepens complexity rather than resolving it. The Anunnaki, once central, remain elusive. They survive not as beings we can define, but as ideas we continue to revisit. They represent order, memory, and authority layered into story. Their endurance lies not in explanation, but in presence. Kingship, too, survives as concept rather than institution. Later cultures inherit and adapt it, reshaping divine authority into new forms. The Sumerian model echoes through Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian traditions, then fades into broader historical memory. Even today, we recognize the pattern. Authority justified by origin, power framed as responsibility, order explained through story. These ideas did not disappear with the ziggurats. They shifted shape and continued. Archaeology reinforces this continuity. Excavations reveal reuse rather than erasure. New structures built atop old ones. Temples restored rather than replaced. Memory preserved through layering. The stars offer their own form of legacy. They have changed little since Sumerian observers tracked them from temple platforms. The same planets move through the same regions of sky. The same constellations rise and set. Time passes, but pattern remains. In this way, the ancient world never fully leaves. It recedes, then returns through attention. Each generation encounters it differently, asking new questions shaped by present concerns. Perhaps that is the true inheritance. Not answers, but frameworks for wondering, ways of holding uncertainty without anxiety, systems that function even when belief is layered rather than fixed. The Sumerians did not leave behind instructions for how to interpret them. They left traces. It is up to us to approach those traces with patience rather than demand. Even now, researchers revise long-held assumptions. A single, retranslated sign can alter a narrative. A newly excavated layer can challenge chronology. Understanding remains provisional. This openness does not weaken the past. It keeps it alive. A closed story becomes static. An open one continues to breathe. As listeners, we participate in this continuity. By giving attention, we reactivate memory. The ancient world does not return exactly as it was. It returns as presence, filtered through time and reflection. What endures is not certainty, but connection. Between earth and sky. Between memory and meaning. Between what was lived and what is remembered. The Sumerian world survives because it allows us to recognize ourselves within it. Our need to explain. Our comfort with pattern. Our acceptance that some things remain unresolved. And as we move toward stillness, toward quiet reflection, we carry this awareness gently. That civilizations end, but questions endure. That stone crumbles, but memory adapts. The story does not conclude here. It continues quietly each time someone pauses long enough to listen. And now we return gently to the present moment, here, where you are listening. Perhaps the room has grown quieter. Perhaps the edges of thought have softened a little. The story does not need to be held anymore. It can rest. The ancient world we've walked through has already settled back into its own silence. The cities lie beneath layers of earth. The tablets remain still in their cases. The questions remain unanswered, and that is all right. They were never meant to rush toward resolution. Outside this moment, the same elements continue their patient movement. Wind passes over land without remembering names. Water moves along paths shaped long before memory. Stone holds its form, not because it tries to, but because time allows it to. The stars are still there. They rise and set as they always have. The same lights watch the rivers spread and retreat. They watched hands press clay into shape. They watch kings rule and cities fade. They watch now, unchanged, indifferent, steady. Nothing in the sky asks to be understood. It simply continues. Perhaps that is the comfort in all of this. That continuity does not depend on certainty. That meaning does not require conclusion. The Sumerians lived with this knowledge, quietly. They built systems that functioned without demanding final answers. They accepted mystery as part of order. Even today we do the same, whether we realize it or not. We live alongside questions we do not resolve. We trust patterns without fully explaining them. We move forward knowing only enough to continue. If you think back to the beginning of this journey, to the rivers before cities, to the land before names, nothing was hurried then either. Change unfolded slowly, quietly, patiently. It still does. Take a breath here. There's no rush. The Anunnaki do not need to be defined to remain meaningful. Kingship does not need to be justified to be understood. Creation stories do not need to be proven to offer insight. They exist as ways of thinking, ways of remembering, ways of placing ourselves within something larger. And now, those stories can fade into the background, like stars dimming at dawn. Not disappearing, just no longer asking for attention. The ground beneath ancient cities rests. It holds what remains without judgment. It has waited thousands of years already. It can wait longer. Silence does not erase the past. It preserves it. Perhaps that is why these stories return most naturally at night. When the world slows, when activity gives way to stillness, when the mind no longer demands clarity, but allows presence. If sleep comes now, you don't need to follow anything further. The story will continue without effort. If you remain awake, that's fine too. You can rest here, in the quiet space between thought and memory. The ancient world is not gone. It is simply still. Wind continues to move over ruins you cannot see. Stars continue to watch without concern. Stone continues to remember without speaking. And somewhere within that ongoing calm between breath and pause, between awareness and rest, the story remains exactly where it has always been. Unfinished, unhurried, at peace.